Elton John went still. Not between songs. Not at the end of a phrase. He was at the piano, mid-performance, his hands moving through the opening of Crocodile Rock with the loose celebratory ease of a man who has played this song more times than he can count. And then the sound came through the monitor beside the piano, and his hands stopped, and every other sound in Studio 6B stopped with them. He did not turn. He did not speak. He sat at the piano with his hands resting on the silent keys and his head slightly bowed, and he did not move for a long time. Jimmy Fallon looked at the monitor. He looked at Elton John. He pressed both hands flat against his eyes. When he brought them down, his face was already gone, not composed, not managed, completely undone. And the tears were running, and he did not try to stop them, and he could not have stopped them if he had tried. He did not speak. He could not speak. He sat behind his desk with everything on his face and nothing coming out of his mouth, and 300 people in the room understood, without being told, that what they were hearing was something that had been waiting a very long time to be heard. It was a Thursday night in May 2024. The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon, Rockefeller Center, New York. Elton John was a guest, not the musical guest in the conventional sense, because Elton John had retired from live performance, had ended the Farewell Yellow Brick Road tour, had said his goodbyes to the stage in the most thorough and public way a man can say goodbye to the thing that has been the center of his life for 50 years. He was here not to perform a set, but to talk. A long conversation. A proper one. The kind of interview that happens when a man has finished the enormous thing and is ready to look back at it. He had agreed to play one song, one only, as a gift to the room. He walked onto the stage the way he still walks onto stages, not with the sequins and the platforms and the spectacular excess of the performing years, but with the particular confidence of a man who has nothing left to prove and has arrived at the profound freedom of that. The audience gave him a welcome that was not routine applause, but something closer to gratitude, the specific gratitude of people who grew up with this music in the rooms where the important things happened and who understood they were in the presence of it for what might be the last time. He sat at the piano. He settled into it. He began to play Crocodile Rock, not as a performance, as a gift, with the ease of 50 years' love. And the room was full and warm, and the band was in behind him, and everything in Studio 6B was exactly as it was supposed to be. And then from the monitor beside the piano came a sound, not loud, not dramatic, just a recording. A voice, a man's voice, elderly, slightly roughened by age, singing along with the opening bars of Crocodile Rock in a wavering, imprecise, completely unself-conscious way, the way people sing alone in a room when they believe no one is listening. Not performing. Not amplified. Just singing. Elton John's hands left the keys. The monitor kept playing. The voice kept singing. 4 more bars. 5. Before it trailed away into silence, and in the silence that followed, Elton John sat at the piano with his hands in his lap and his head bowed and did not speak and did not move. Jimmy Fallon pressed both hands over his eyes. The entire studio froze. Questlove's sticks came to rest. The floor director stopped where he was standing and did not move again. The cameras held. No one in the production booth touched anything. The audience sat in the particular stillness of people who have just heard something they cannot explain and are waiting, without breathing, for the explanation to arrive. What was that voice? Whose recording was it? Why had it stopped Elton John, who has heard everything, who has played every room in the world, who has sat at a piano in front of 100,000 people and held it together? Why had that thin, wavering, ordinary voice reached inside him and taken everything away? The monitor was silent now. The studio was silent. And Elton John sat at the piano in the silence and finally, slowly, lifted his head. His face was wet. Jimmy Fallon lowered his hands from his eyes. He tried to speak. His mouth moved. Nothing came. 300 people held their breath. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in the winter of 1970. Elton John wasn't always Elton John. The icon, the legend, the most flamboyant and beloved figure in the history of rock and roll. In January 1970, Elton John was 22 years old and had been a professional musician for 4 years, and famous for approximately none of them. He had written songs for other people, had played piano on sessions, had recorded an album the previous year called Empty Sky that had been released quietly and reviewed briefly and had not changed anything. He was signed to a label. He had a manager. He had a writing partner named Bernie Taupin, with whom he shared a peculiar and productive working arrangement. Bernie wrote the words, Elton set them to music. They rarely discussed the songs directly. The collaboration operated through a kind of mutual trust that was either unusual or impossible depending on how you looked at it. He was, in January 1970, a working musician with a second album nearly finished, and no particular reason to believe the world was about to find him. The album was Elton John, self-titled, the one that would change everything. It had been recorded. It was being mixed. It would be released in April. Elton did not yet know what it was going to do. Nobody knew. Albums do not announce their own significance in advance. He was living then in a flat in Northwood Hills, in northwest London, a flat that was comfortable and small and shared with 2 other musicians, and that had, in the front room, a slightly damaged upright piano on which Elton John spent the majority of his waking hours. He practiced the way dedicated pianists practice, not as rehearsal but as conversation, as the primary mode of being in the world. The piano was how he thought. It was how he processed. It was, at 22, the only place where he was entirely himself. The building had thin walls. Old construction, pre-war, sound moved through it the way sound moves through old buildings, freely, without asking permission. The flat below his was occupied by a retired schoolteacher named George Aldridge. He was 71 years old. He had spent 40 years teaching mathematics at a secondary school in Harrow and had retired the previous spring, and retirement had not suited him the way he had imagined it would. He had imagined quiet and rest and the long mornings with a newspaper. What he had found was that quiet was bearable only in moderate doses, and that the absence of a room full of children, whose noise and disorder he had complained about for 40 years, had turned out to be a kind of loss he had not anticipated. He lived alone. His wife had died in 1964. His children were grown and scattered, and the flat was orderly and silent in a way that felt less like peace than like absence. The piano through the ceiling was not always welcome. George Aldridge was not a music person by any particular formation. He had a record player and a small collection of records, and he listened to them the way people listen when music is company rather than passion. He had never played an instrument. He had no technical language for what he was hearing through the ceiling. But he noticed, over the weeks of January and February 1970, that the piano above him was doing something. Not practicing scales. Not running exercises. Building something. The same passages returning again and again, slightly different each time, the way a craftsman returns to a joint that isn't quite right yet, adjusting by fractions. He noticed that the playing had character, not mere competence, not performance, but a quality that he could not name precisely, and that kept him sitting in his armchair listening when he had intended to read. One evening in late February, he knocked on the door of the flat above his. He had brought up a piece of paper on which he had written down what he wanted to say, because he was a precise man and did not trust himself to say it correctly without preparation. Elton John opened the door. He has described this later, not publicly, not in interviews, in a private letter, as a surprise. He had not known anyone in the building paid attention to the piano. He had assumed the sound disappeared into the walls. George Aldridge looked at him for a moment. Then he read from his paper. He said, "I have been listening to you play for 6 weeks. I am not a musician, and I cannot tell you whether what you are doing is technically correct or technically remarkable. What I can tell you is that it has been the best part of every evening since January, and that I have found myself staying in to hear it when I might otherwise have gone out. I do not know your name. I want you to know that what you are doing matters to someone. That is all I came to say." He folded the paper. He put it back in his pocket. He went back downstairs. Elton John stood in the doorway of his flat for a moment. Then he went back to the piano and played until 2 in the morning. They spoke only 3 more times after that. Politely, briefly, in the way of neighbors who are not quite friends, but who carry a regard for each other that has no occasion to express itself. George Aldridge came to the door once more, in March, to say that he had heard on the radio that Elton John had an album coming, and that he intended to buy it. He said it with the formality of a man fulfilling a commitment. Elton John thanked him. George Aldridge nodded and went back downstairs. The album came out in April 1970 and changed everything. The way certain things change everything, not gradually, but all at once. A before and an after, with no transition between them. By June the world knew the name. By the end of the year the name was everywhere. By 1971 Elton John was what he would be for the next 50 years, the thing so large it is difficult now to remember it was ever becoming rather than being. He moved out of the flat in Northwood Hills in September 1970. He did not say goodbye to George Aldridge, not from unkindness, from the overwhelming forward momentum of a life that had just accelerated past every previous speed. He moved into a different life, and the flat in Northwood Hills became one of the things left behind in the speed of the moving. He thought about George Aldridge. Not often. The years were very full, but in certain moments, certain late nights in certain hotel rooms in cities he could not always immediately name, he thought about a retired schoolteacher who had climbed a flight of stairs in February 1970 with a piece of paper in his hand, who had read from it in a doorway and said nothing that was not precisely true, and then gone back downstairs. He thought. That was a kind thing. He thought, I never thanked him properly. He thought, I should find him. He did not find him. The years did what years do. George Aldridge had died in 1987 at the age of 88 in a care home in Harrow, not far from the school, where he had taught mathematics for 40 years. He had outlived both his children. He had no grandchildren. His estate had been modest, and had been administered by a solicitor who had found, among his possessions, a small reel-to-reel tape recorder of a kind that had been common in the late 1960s. And on a shelf above it, a single tape and a paper sleeve on which George Aldridge had written, in his precise mathematical handwriting, the words, "Piano, upstairs." January, April 1970. The solicitor had kept the tape with the estate records. It had passed through 2 storage facilities over the following decades. In 2022, a researcher working on a retrospective about the early 1970s London music scene had been working through estate archives and had come across the tape, had played a portion of it, and had recognized immediately what he was hearing, not the piano. which was distant and slightly muffled by the floor between the flats, but the voice on the tape. Because what he heard alongside the piano was George Aldridge himself in his armchair below, quietly singing along to what he was hearing, humming first, then the words when he knew them, then humming again, the unself-conscious singing of a man alone in a room who did not know he was being recorded and did not know the tape recorder was running, because George Aldridge had turned it on one evening to record a radio program and forgotten to turn it off, and the piano had started upstairs and he had sat down to listen. And the tape had caught all of it, the piano, the thin ceiling, and George Aldridge singing along, alone, in the room below. The researcher had contacted Elton John's office. What happened next had taken 18 months. Finding the estate, establishing the provenance of the tape, making certain that what was on it was what it appeared to be. Elton John had been told in the autumn of 2023. He had listened to a portion of the tape in his home in Windsor and had not been able to finish it. He had asked for time. He had taken the time. He had decided, eventually, what the right thing to do with it was. He had called Jimmy Fallon's team in February 2024. Behind the scenes, Elton John had made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. He had told the Tonight Show producers only what was necessary, that there was a recording, that it would be played through the monitor beside the piano during his performance, and that whatever happened after it played should be allowed to happen. No cut to commercial. No intervention. Whatever the room became, let it become that. The producers had agreed with the kind of trust that is extended to Elton John in 2024, without conditions. What they did not know, what Elton John had not told anyone except his closest manager, was that he had spent the 6 months since first hearing the tape doing something he had not done for the purpose of any audience. He had written a song. Not a Topin Elton song. Bernie had not written the words. Elton had written the words himself for the first time in his career, because these words could not be anyone else's. He had written them for a man who had climbed a flight of stairs in February 1970 with a piece of paper, who had said the truest and kindest thing anyone said to him in the year his life changed, who had gone back downstairs and bought the album when it came out, and sat alone in his flat with a reel-to-reel tape running, and sung along to the piano coming through his ceiling. The song was finished. He had not decided, until tonight, whether he would play it. He had decided. Back in the studio now, Elton John lifting his head from the silent piano, Jimmy Fallon with his face undone and his voice gone, 300 people not breathing. Elton John turned on the bench. Not toward Jimmy Fallon, toward the audience, toward the camera. He said, his voice steady in the way that grief sometimes makes voices steady, not because the feeling is controlled, but because it has become the only thing. His name was George Aldridge. He lived below me in Northwood Hills in 1970. He knocked on my door once, in February, and read to me from a piece of paper and went back downstairs. He never knew what that cost him to do. He never knew that I was about to give up. The room was completely still. Elton John said, he died in 1987. He never knew what the music became. He never knew that I thought about him. He was alone when he died, and he had no one to leave anything to, and the only thing that survived him was a tape of himself singing to a piano through a ceiling that he believed nobody could hear. He paused. I could hear, he said. I heard everything. But this is the moment no one in the studio and no one watching at home ever saw coming. Elton John turned back to the piano. He placed his hands on the keys. And he played the first chord of a song that no one in that room had ever heard. A song written in his own words, for a retired schoolteacher in Northwood Hills who had climbed a flight of stairs with a piece of paper in February 1970 and changed the direction of a life that would change the direction of everything after it. He played it from the beginning. He sang it through. Every word in his own hand, which is the hand of a man who has spent 50 years setting other people's words to music and has finally, in his retirement, found the one set of words that required his voice alone. The song was 4 minutes and 20 seconds long. In those 4 minutes and 20 seconds, Questlove did not move. The cameraman on the floor held the camera but did not operate it. The director in the control booth sat with both hands in his lap. Jimmy Fallon put his elbows on the desk and his face in his hands and wept without any attempt at recovery, without any professional management of himself, without anything except the full feeling of what was happening, which was too large for management. When the last note ended, the studio was silent for a full 4 seconds. Then 300 people stood, and the sound they made was not applause but release, the sound of something that had been held for 54 years finally, in a room in Rockefeller Center on a Thursday night in May 2024, being let go. The song has not been commercially released. Elton John has said only that it is finished and that he will decide in his own time what to do with it. Musicians who have heard it in private have said nothing publicly because he has asked them not to. The title, which he has shared, is 2 words: George's Piano. The original reel-to-reel tape is in Elton John's home in Windsor, in a room where he keeps the things that matter most to him. Not on display, not framed, not labeled. Sitting on a shelf beside a few other objects whose significance is known only to him. George Aldridge taught mathematics at a secondary school in Harrow for 40 years. He taught more than 2,000 students. None of them knew about the piano through the ceiling. None of them knew about the February evening and the piece of paper and the flight of stairs. He did not tell stories about himself. He taught mathematics. He went home. He sat in his armchair. He listened. He was right about what he heard. Some people climb 1 flight of stairs, once with a piece of paper, and say the true thing, and go back downstairs. And the music that follows fills the world for 50 years and carries their name in it without ever saying it aloud, until the night it finally does.